After World War II, when the United States displaced Britain as global hegemon, Washington adopted the same stand, making it clear that the United States would provide no aid to Egypt unless it adhered to the standard rules for the weak, which the United States continued to violate, imposing high tariffs to bar Egyptian cotton and causing a debilitating dollar shortage, as per the usual interpretation of market principles. It is small wonder that the campaign of hatred against the United States that concerned Eisenhower was based on the recognition that the United States supports dictators and blocks democracy and development, as do its allies. In Adam Smith's defense, it should be added that he recognized what would happen if Britain followed the rules of sound economics, now called neoliberalism. He warned that if British manufacturers, merchants, and investors turned abroad, they might profit but England would suffer. But he felt that they would be guided by a home bias, so that as if by an invisible hand, England would be spared the ravages of economic rationality. The passage is hard to miss. It is the one occurrence of the famous phrase, invisible hand, in The Wealth of Nations. The other leading founder of classical economics, David Ricardo, drew similar conclusions, hoping that what is called home bias would lead men of property to be satisfied with the low rate of profits in their own country, rather than seek a more advantageous employment for their wealth in foreign nations, feelings that, he added, I should be sorry to see weakened. Their predictions aside, the instincts of the classical economists were sound. The Iranian and Chinese threats. The democratic uprising in the Arab world is sometimes compared to Eastern Europe in 1989, but on dubious grounds. In 1989, the democratic uprising was tolerated by the Russians, and supported by Western power in accord with standard doctrine. It plainly conformed to economic and strategic objectives, and was therefore a noble achievement, greatly honored, unlike the struggles at the same time to defend the people's fundamental human rights in Central America, in the words of the assassinated Archbishop of El Salvador, one of the hundreds of thousands of victims of the military forces armed and trained by Washington. There was no Mikhail Gorbachev in the West throughout those horrendous years, and there is none today. And Western power remains hostile to democracy in the Arab world for good reasons. Grand area doctrines continue to apply to contemporary crises and confrontations. In Western policymaking circles and political commentary, the Iranian threat is considered to pose the greatest danger to world order, and hence must be the primary focus of U.S. foreign policy, with Europe trailing along politely. Years ago, Israeli military historian Martin van Creveld wrote that, the world has witnessed how the United States attacked Iraq for, as it turned out, no reason at all. Had the Iranians not tried to build nuclear weapons, they would be crazy, particularly when they are under constant threat of attack, in violation of the UN Charter. The United States and Europe are united in punishing Iran for its threat to stability, in the technical sense of the term, meaning conformity to U.S. demands, but it is useful to recall how isolated they are. The non-aligned countries have vigorously supported Iran's right to enrich uranium. The major regional power, Turkey, voted against a U.S.-initiated sanctions motion in the Security Council, along with Brazil, the most admired country of the Global South. Their disobedience led to sharp censure. Not for the first time, Turkey had been bitterly condemned in 2003 when the government followed the will of 95% of its population, and refused to participate in the invasion of Iraq, thus demonstrating its weak grasp of democracy, Western style. While the United States can tolerate Turkish disobedience, though with dismay, China is harder to ignore. The press warns that China's investors and traders are now filling a vacuum in Iran as businesses from many other nations, especially in Europe, pull out, and in particular, that China is expanding its dominant role in Iran's energy industries. Washington is reacting with a touch of desperation. The State Department warned China that if it wants to be accepted in the international community, a technical term referring to the United States and whoever happens to agree with it, then it must not skirt and evade international responsibilities, which are clear, namely, follow U.S. orders. China is unlikely to be impressed. There is also much concern about the growing Chinese military threat. A recent Pentagon study warned that China's military budget is approaching 1/5 of what the Pentagon spent to operate and carry out the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, a fraction of the U.S. military budget, of course. China's expansion of military forces might deny the ability of American warships to operate in international waters off its coast, the New York Times added. Off the coast of China, that is. It has yet to be proposed that the U.S. should eliminate military forces that deny the Caribbean to Chinese warships. China's lack of understanding of the rules of international civility is further illustrated by its objections to plans for the advanced nuclear-powered aircraft carrier George Washington to join naval exercises a few miles off China's coast, giving it the alleged capacity to strike Beijing. In contrast, the West understands that such U.S. operations are all undertaken to defend its stability and its own security. The liberal New Republic expresses its concern that China sent 10 warships through international waters just off the Japanese island of Okinawa. That is indeed a provocation, unlike the fact, unmentioned, that Washington has converted the island into a major military base in defiance of vehement protests by the people of Okinawa. That is not a provocation, on the standard principle that we own the world. Deep-seated imperial doctrine aside, there is good reason for China's neighbors to be concerned about its growing military and commercial power. While grand area doctrine still prevails, the capacity to implement it has declined. The peak of U.S. power was after World War II, when it had literally half the world's wealth. But that naturally declined, as other industrial economies recovered from the devastation of the war and decolonization took its agonizing course. By the early 1970s, the U.S. share of global wealth had fallen to about 25%, and the industrial world had become tripolar, North America, Europe, and East Asia, then Japan-based. There was also a sharp change in the U.S. economy in the 1970s, toward financialization and export of production. A variety of factors converged to create a vicious cycle of radical concentration of wealth, primarily in the top fraction of 1% of the population, mostly CEOs, hedge fund managers, and the like. That leads to the concentration of political power, hence state policies to increase economic concentration, fiscal policies, rules of corporate governance, deregulation, and much more. Meanwhile, the costs of electoral campaigns skyrocketed, driving the parties into the pockets of concentrated capital, increasingly financial, the Republicans reflexively, the Democrats, by now what used to be moderate Republicans, not far behind. Elections have become a charade, run by the public relations industry. After his 2008 victory, Obama won an award from the industry for the best marketing campaign of the year. Executives were euphoric. In the business press they explained that they had been marketing candidates like other commodities since Ronald Reagan, but 2008 was their greatest achievement and would change the style in corporate boardrooms. The 2012 election cost over $2 billion, mostly in corporate funding, and the 2016 election is expected to cost twice that. Small wonder that Obama selected business leaders for top positions in his administration. The public is angry and frustrated, but as long as the doctrine described by Mwasher prevails, that doesn't matter. While wealth and power have narrowly concentrated, for most of the population real incomes have stagnated and people have been getting by with increased work hours, debt, and asset inflation, regularly destroyed by the financial crises that began as the regulatory apparatus was dismantled starting in the 1980s. None of this is problematic for the very wealthy, who benefit from the too big to fail government insurance policy. That government insurance is no small matter. Considering just the ability of banks to borrow at lower rates, thanks to the implicit taxpayer subsidy, Bloomberg News, citing an International Monetary Fund working paper, estimates that taxpayers give big banks $83 billion a year, virtually their entire profit, a matter that is crucial to understanding why the big banks present such a threat to the global economy. Furthermore, the banks and investment firms can make risky transactions, with rich rewards, and when the system inevitably crashes, they can run to the nanny state for a taxpayer bailout, clutching their copies of F.A. Hayek and Milton Friedman. That has been the regular process since the Reagan years, each crisis more extreme than the last, for the public population, that is. Real unemployment is at depression levels for much of the population, while Goldman Sachs, one of the main architects of the current crisis, is richer than ever. It quietly announced $17.5 billion in compensation for 2010, with CEO Lloyd Blankfein receiving a $12.6 million bonus, while his base salary more than tripled. It wouldn't do to focus attention on such facts as these. Accordingly, propaganda must seek to blame others, like public sector workers, with their fat salaries and exorbitant pensions, all fantasy, on the model of Reaganite imagery of black mothers being driven in their limousines to pick up welfare checks, and other models that need not be mentioned. We all must tighten our belts, almost all, that is. Teachers are a particularly good target, as part of the deliberate effort to destroy the public education system from kindergarten through the universities by privatization. Again, a policy that is good for the wealthy, but a disaster for the population as well as the long-term health of the economy, though that is one of the externalities that is put to the side insofar as market principles prevail. Another fine target, always, is immigrants. That has been true throughout U.S. history, even more so at times of economic crisis, and exacerbated now by a sense that our country is being taken away from us. The white population will soon become a minority. One can understand the anger of aggrieved individuals, but the cruelty of the policy is shocking. Who are the immigrants targeted? In eastern Massachusetts, where I live, many are Mayans fleeing the aftermath of the virtual genocide in the Guatemalan highlands carried out by Reagan's favorite killers. Others are Mexican victims of Clinton's North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, one of those rare government agreements that managed to harm working people in all three of the participating countries. As NAFTA was rammed through Congress over popular objection in 1994, Clinton also initiated the militarization of the U.S.-Mexican border, previously fairly open. It was presumably understood that Mexican campesinos cannot compete with highly subsidized U.S. agribusiness, and that Mexican businesses would not survive competition with U.S. multinationals, which must be granted national treatment under the mislabeled free trade agreements, a privilege granted only to corporate persons, not those of flesh and blood. Not surprisingly, These measures led to a flood of desperate refugees and to rising anti-immigrant hysteria on the part of the victims of state corporate policies at home. Much the same appears to be happening in Europe, where racism is probably more rampant than in the United States. One can only watch with wonder as Italy complains about the flow of refugees from Libya, the scene of the first post-World War I genocide, in the newly liberated East, at the hands of Italy's fascist government. Or when France, still today the main protector of the brutal dictatorships in its former colonies, manages to overlook its hideous atrocities in Africa while French President Nicolas Sarkozy warns grimly of the flood of immigrants, and Marine Le Pen objects that he is doing nothing to prevent it. I need not mention Belgium, which may win the prize for what Adam Smith called the savage injustice of the Europeans. The rise of neo-fascist parties in much of Europe would be a frightening phenomenon, even if we were not to recall what happened on the continent in the recent past. Just imagine the reaction if Jews were being expelled from France to misery and oppression, and then witness the non-reaction when the same is happening to the Roma, also victims of the Holocaust and Europe's most brutalized population. In Hungary, the neo-fascist party Jobbik gained 21% of the vote in national elections, perhaps unsurprising when 3/4 of the population feels that they are worse off than under communist rule. We might be relieved that in Austria the ultra-right Jörg Haider won only 10% of the vote in 2008, were it not for the fact that the Freedom Party, outflanking him from the right, won more than 17%. It is chilling to recall that, in 1928, the Nazis won less than 3% of the vote in Germany. In England, the British National Party and the English Defence League, on the ultra-racist right, are major forces. In Germany, Thilo Sarrazin's book-length lament that immigrants are destroying the country was a runaway bestseller, while Chancellor Angela Merkel, though she condemned the book, declared that multiculturalism had utterly failed. The Turks imported to do the dirty work in Germany are failing to become blonde and blue-eyed true Aryans. Those with a sense of irony may recall that Benjamin Franklin, one of the leading figures of the Enlightenment, warned that the newly liberated colonies should be wary of allowing Germans to immigrate because they were too swarthy, and Swedes as well. Into the 20th century, ludicrous myths of Anglo-Saxon purity were common in the United States, including among presidents and other leading figures. Racism in our literary culture has been a rank obscenity. It has been much easier to eradicate polio than this horrifying plague, which regularly becomes more virulent in times of economic distress. I do not want to end without mentioning another externality that is dismissed in market systems, the fate of the species. Systemic risk in the financial system can be remedied by the taxpayer, but no one will come to the rescue if the environment is destroyed. That it must be destroyed is close to an institutional imperative. Business leaders who are conducting propaganda campaigns to convince the population that anthropogenic global warming is a liberal hoax understand full well how grave is the threat, but they must maximize short-term profit and market share. If they don't, someone else will. This vicious cycle could well turn out to be lethal. To see how grave the danger is, simply have a look at Congress in the United States, propelled into power by business funding and propaganda. Almost all the Republicans are climate deniers. They have already begun to cut funding for measures that might mitigate environmental catastrophe. Worse, some are true believers. Take for example the new head of a subcommittee on the environment who explained that global warming cannot be a problem, because God promised Noah that there will not be another flood. If such things were happening in some small and remote country, we might laugh, but not when they are happening in the richest and most powerful country in the world. And before we laugh, we might also bear in mind that the current economic crisis is traceable in no small measure to the fanatic faith in such dogmas as the efficient market hypothesis, and in general to what Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz, 15 years ago, called the religion that markets know best, which prevented the central bank and the economics profession, with a few honorable exceptions, from taking notice of an $8 trillion housing bubble that had no basis at all in economic fundamentals, and that devastated the economy when it burst. All of this, and much more, can proceed as long as the Washer doctrine prevails. As long as the general population is passive, apathetic, and diverted to consumerism or hatred of the vulnerable, then the powerful can do as they please, and those who survive will be left to contemplate the outcome. 5. American decline, causes and consequences. It is a common theme that the United States, which, only a few years ago was hailed to stride the world as a colossus with unparalleled power and unmatched appeal, is in decline, ominously facing the prospect of its final decay. This theme, articulated in the summer 2011 issue of the Journal of the Academy of Political Science, is indeed widely believed, and with some reason, though a number of qualifications are in order. The decline has in fact been underway since the high point of U.S. power shortly after World War II, and the remarkable rhetoric of the decade of triumphalism after the Soviet Union imploded was mostly self-delusion. Furthermore, the commonly drawn corollary that power will shift to China and India is highly dubious. They are poor countries with severe internal problems. The world is surely becoming more diverse, but despite America's decline, in the foreseeable future there is no competitor for global hegemonic power. To recall briefly some of the relevant history, during World War II U.S. planners recognized that the country would emerge from the war in a position of overwhelming power. It is quite clear from the documentary record that President Roosevelt was aiming at United States hegemony in the post-war world, to quote the assessment of diplomatic historian Jeffrey Warner, one of the leading specialists on the topic. Plans were developed, along lines discussed above, for the United States to control what was called a grand area, spanning the globe. These doctrines still prevail, though their reach has declined. The wartime plans, soon to be carefully implemented, were not unrealistic. The United States had long been by far the richest country in the world. The war ended the Great Depression, and American industrial capacity almost quadrupled, while rivals were decimated. At war's end the United States had half the world's wealth and unmatched security. Each region of the Grand Area was assigned its function within the global system. The ensuing Cold War consisted largely of efforts by the two superpowers to enforce order in their own domains, for the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, for the United States, most of the world. By 1949 the Grand Area that the United States planned to control was already seriously eroding with the loss of China, as it is routinely called. Point 4. The phrase is interesting. One can only lose what one possesses, and it is taken for granted that the United States owns most of the world by right. Shortly after, Southeast Asia began to slip free from Washington's control, leading to horrendous wars in Indochina and huge massacres in Indonesia in 1965 as U.S. dominance was restored. Meanwhile, subversion and massive violence continued elsewhere in an effort to maintain what is called stability. But decline was inevitable, as the industrial world reconstructed itself and decolonization pursued its agonizing course. By 1970, the U.S. share of world wealth had declined to about 25%. The industrial world was becoming tripolar, with major centers in the United States, Europe, and Asia, then Japan, centered and already becoming the globe's most dynamic region. 20 years later, the USSR collapsed. Washington's reaction teaches us a good deal about the reality of the Cold War. The first Bush administration, then in office, immediately declared that its policies would remain essentially unchanged, although with different pretexts. The huge military establishment would be maintained not for defense against the Russians but to confront the technological sophistication of Third World powers. Similarly, it would be necessary to maintain the defense industrial base, a euphemism for advanced industry highly reliant on government subsidy and initiative. Intervention forces still had to be aimed at the Middle East, where serious problems could not be laid at the Kremlin's door, contrary to half a century of deceit. It was quietly conceded that the problem had always been radical nationalism, that is, attempts by countries to pursue an independent course in violation of grand area principles. These principles were not to be modified in any fundamental way, as the Clinton Doctrine, under which the United States could unilaterally use military power to further its economic interests, and the global expansion of NATO would soon make clear. There was a period of euphoria after the collapse of the superpower enemy, replete with excited tales about the end of history, and odd acclaim for President Bill Clinton's foreign policy, which had entered a noble phase, with a saintly glow, as for the first time in history a nation would be guided by altruism and dedicated to principles and values. Nothing now stood in the way of an idealistic new world bent on ending inhumanity, which could at last carry forward, unhindered, the emerging international norm of humanitarian intervention. And that's to sample just a few of the impassioned accolades of prominent intellectuals at the time. Not all were so enraptured. The traditional victims, the Global South, bitterly condemned the so-called right of humanitarian intervention, recognizing it to be nothing but the old right of imperial domination tricked out in new clothing. Meanwhile, more sober voices among the policy elite at home saw that, for much of the world, the United States was becoming the rogue superpower, the single greatest external threat to their societies, and that the prime rogue state today is the United States, to quote Samuel P. Huntington, Harvard professor of the science of government, and Robert Jervis, president of the American Political Science Association. After George W. Bush took over, increasingly hostile world opinion could scarcely be ignored. In the Arab world in particular, Bush's approval ratings plummeted. Obama has achieved the impressive feat of sinking still lower, down to 5% approval in Egypt and not much higher elsewhere in the region. Meanwhile, decline continued. In the past decade, South America has also been lost. That is serious enough, as the Nixon administration was planning the destruction of Chilean democracy. The U.S.-backed military coup on the first 9/11 that installed the dictatorship of General Augusto Pinochet. The National Security Council ominously warned that if the United States could not control Latin America, it could not expect to achieve a successful order elsewhere in the world. Far more serious, however, would be moves toward independence in the Middle East, for reasons recognized clearly in early post-World War II planning. A further danger, there might be meaningful moves toward democracy. New York Times executive editor Bill Keller wrote movingly of Washington's yearning to embrace the aspiring Democrats across North Africa and the Middle East. But polls of Arab opinion revealed very clearly that it would be a disaster for Washington if there were steps toward the creation of functioning democracies, where public opinion would influence policy. As we have seen, the Arab population regards the United States as a major threat, and would expel it and its allies from the region if given a choice. While long-standing U.S. policies remain largely stable, with tactical adjustments, under Obama there have been some significant changes. Military analyst Yochi Dreesen and his co-authors observed in The Atlantic that while Bush's policy was to capture and torture suspects, Obama simply assassinates them, rapidly increasing the use of terror weapons, drones, and special forces personnel, many of them assassination teams. Special forces units have been deployed in 147 countries. Now as large as Canada's entire military, these soldiers are, in effect, a private army of the president, a matter discussed in detail by American investigative journalist Nick Turse on the website Tom Dispatch. The team that Obama sent to assassinate Osama bin Laden had already carried out perhaps a dozen similar missions in Pakistan. As these and many other developments illustrate, though U.S. hegemony has declined, its ambition has not. Another common theme, at least among those who are not willfully blind, is that American decline is in no small measure self-inflicted. The comic opera in Washington centering around whether or not to shut down the government, which disgusts the country, a large majority of which thinks that Congress should just be disbanded, and bewilders the world, has few analogues in the annals of parliamentary democracy. The spectacle is even coming to frighten the sponsors of the charade. Corporate powers are now concerned that the extremists they helped put in office may choose to bring down the edifice on which their own wealth and privilege relies, the powerful nanny state that caters to their interests. The eminent American social philosopher John Dewey once described politics as the shadow cast on society by big business, warning that attenuation of the shadow will not change the substance. Since the 1970s, that shadow has become a dark cloud enveloping society and the political system. Corporate power, by now largely made up of financial capital, has reached a point where both political organizations, which by now barely resemble traditional parties, are far to the right of the population on the major issues under debate. For the public, the primary domestic concern is the severe crisis of unemployment. Under prevailing circumstances, that critical problem could have been overcome only by a significant government stimulus, well beyond the one Obama initiated in 2009, which barely matched declines in state and local spending, though it still did probably save millions of jobs. For financial institutions, the primary concern is the deficit. Therefore, only the deficit is under discussion. A large majority of the population, 72%, favor addressing the deficit by taxing the very rich. Cutting health programs is opposed by overwhelming majorities, 69% in the case of Medicaid, 78% for Medicare. The likely outcome is therefore the opposite. Reporting the results of a study of how the public would eliminate the deficit, Stephen Cull, director of the Program for Public Consultation, which conducted the study, writes that, clearly both the administration and the Republican-led House are out of step with the public's values and priorities in regard to the budget. The biggest difference in spending is that the public favored deep cuts in defense spending, while the administration and the House propose modest increases. The public also favored more spending on job training, education, and pollution control than did either the administration or the House. The costs of the Bush-Obama wars in Iraq and Afghanistan are now estimated to run as high as $4.4 trillion, a major victory for Osama bin Laden, whose announced goal was to bankrupt America by drawing it into a trap. The 2011 U.S. military budget, almost matching that of the rest of the world combined, was higher in real, inflation-adjusted, terms than at any time since World War II, and slated go even higher. There is much loose talk about projected cuts, but such reporting fails to mention that if they take place at all, they will be from projected future Pentagon growth rates. The deficit crisis has largely been manufactured as a weapon to destroy hated social programs, on which a large part of the population relies. The highly respected economics correspondent Martin Wolf, of the Financial Times, writes, "It is not that tackling the U.S. fiscal position is urgent. The U.S. is able to borrow on easy terms, with yields on 10-year bonds close to 3%, as the few non-hysterics predicted. The fiscal challenge is long-term, not immediate." Significantly, he adds, the astonishing feature of the federal fiscal position is that revenues are forecast to be a mere 14.4% of GDP in 2011, far below their post-war average of close to 18%. Individual income tax is forecast to be a mere 6.3% of GDP in 2011. This non-American cannot understand what the fuss is about. In 1988, at the end of Ronald Reagan's term, receipts were 18.2% of GDP. Tax revenue has to rise substantially if the deficit is to close. Astonishing indeed, but deficit reduction is the demand of the financial institutions and the super-rich, and in a rapidly declining democracy, that's what counts. Though the deficit crisis has been manufactured for reasons of savage class war, the long-term debt crisis is serious, and has been ever since Ronald Reagan's fiscal irresponsibility turned the United States from the world's leading creditor to the world's leading debtor, tripling the national debt and raising threats to the economy that were rapidly escalated by George W. Bush. For now, however, it is the crisis of unemployment that is the gravest concern. The final compromise on the crisis, or, more accurately, the capitulation to the far right, was the opposite of what the public wanted. Few serious economists would disagree with Harvard economist Lawrence Summers that America's current problem is much more a jobs and growth deficit than an excessive budget deficit, and that the deal reached in Washington to raise the debt limit, though preferable to a highly unlikely default, is likely to cause further harm to a deteriorating economy. Not even mentioned is the possibility, discussed by economist Dean Baker, that the deficit might be eliminated if the dysfunctional privatized healthcare system were replaced by one similar to those in other industrial societies, which have half the per capita costs and at least comparable health outcomes. The financial institutions and the pharmaceutical industry, however, are far too powerful for such options even to be considered, though the thought seems hardly utopian. Off the agenda for similar reasons are other economically sensible options, such as a small financial transactions tax. Meanwhile, new gifts are regularly lavished on Wall Street. The House Committee on Appropriations cut the budget request for the Securities and Exchange Commission, the prime barrier against financial fraud, and Congress wields other weapons in its battle against future generations. In the face of Republican opposition to environmental protection, a major American utility is shelving the nation's most prominent effort to capture carbon dioxide from an existing coal-burning power plant, dealing a severe blow to efforts to rein in emissions responsible for global warming, the New York Times reports. Such self-inflicted blows, while increasingly powerful, are not a recent innovation. They trace back to the 1970s, when the national political economy underwent major transformations, bringing to an end what is commonly called the golden age of state capitalism. Two major elements of this shift were financialization and the offshoring of production, both related to the decline in the rate of profit in manufacturing, and the dismantling of the post-war Bretton Woods system of capital controls and regulated currencies. The ideological triumph of free market doctrines, highly selective as always, administered further blows as these doctrines were translated into deregulation, rules of corporate governance linking huge CEO rewards to short-term profits, and other such policy decisions. The resulting concentration of wealth yielded greater political power, accelerating a vicious cycle that has led to extraordinary wealth for a tiny minority while for the large majority real incomes have virtually stagnated. At the same time, the cost of elections skyrocketed, driving both parties ever deeper into corporate pockets. What remains of political democracy has been further undermined as both parties turn to auctioning off congressional leadership positions. Political economist Thomas Ferguson observes that, uniquely among legislatures in the developed world, U.S. congressional parties now post prices for key slots in the lawmaking process. The legislators who fund the party get the posts, virtually compelling them to become servants of private capital even beyond the norm. The result, Ferguson adds, is that debates rely heavily on the endless repetition of a handful of slogans that have been battle-tested for their appeal to national investor blocs and interest groups that the leadership relies on for resources. The post-Golden Age economy is enacting a nightmare envisaged by the classical economists Adam Smith and David Ricardo. In the past 30 years, the masters of mankind, as Smith called them, have abandoned any sentimental concern for the welfare of their own society. They have instead concentrated on short-term gain and huge bonuses, the country be damned. A graphic illustration is on the front page of the New York Times as I write. Two major stories appear side by side. One discusses how Republicans fervently oppose any deal that involves increased revenues, a euphemism for taxes on the rich. The other is headlined, even marked up, "Luxury goods fly off shelves." This developing picture is aptly described in a brochure for investors produced by Citigroup, the huge bank that is once again feeding at the public trough, as it has done regularly for 30 years in a cycle of risky loans, huge profits, crashes, and bailouts. The bank's analysts describe a world that is dividing into two blocks, the plutonomy and the rest, creating a global society in which growth is powered by the wealthy few and largely consumed by them. Left out of the gains of the plutonomy are the non-rich, the vast majority, now sometimes called the global precariat, the workforce living an unstable and increasingly penurious existence. In the United States, they are subject to growing worker insecurity, the basis for a healthy economy, as Federal Reserve Chair Alan Greenspan explained to Congress while lauding his own skills in economic management. This is the real shift of power in global society. The Citigroup analysts advise investors to focus on the very rich, where the action is. Their plutonomy stock basket, as they call it, has far outperformed the World Index of Developed Markets since 1985. When the Reagan-Thatcher economic programs for enriching the very wealthy were really taking off. Before the 2008 crash for which they were largely responsible, the new post-Golden Age financial institutions had gained startling economic power, more than tripling their share of corporate profits. After the crash, a number of economists began to inquire into their function in purely economic terms. Nobel laureate in economics Robert Solow concludes that their general impact is likely to be negative, because the successes probably add little or nothing to the efficiency of the real economy, while the disasters transfer wealth from taxpayers to financiers. By shredding the remnants of political democracy, these financial institutions lay the basis for carrying the lethal process forward, as long as their victims are willing to suffer in silence. Returning to the common theme that the United States is in decline, ominously facing the prospect of its final decay. While the laments are considerably exaggerated, they contain elements of truth. American power in the world is, indeed, continuing its decline from its early post-World War II peak. While the United States remains the most powerful state in the world, nevertheless, global power is continuing to diversify, and the United States is increasingly unable to impose its will. But decline has many dimensions and complexities. The domestic society is also in decline in significant ways, and what is decline for some may be unimaginable wealth and privilege for others. For the plutonomy, more narrowly, a tiny fraction of it at the upper extreme, privilege and wealth abound, while for the great majority prospects are often gloomy, and many even face problems of survival in a country with unparalleled advantages. 6. Is America over? Some significant anniversaries are solemnly commemorated. Japan's attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, for example. Others are ignored, and we can often learn valuable lessons from them about what is likely to lie ahead. There was no commemoration of the 50th anniversary of President John F. Kennedy's decision to launch the most destructive and murderous act of aggression of the post-World War II period, the invasion of South Vietnam, and later all of Indochina, leaving millions dead and 4 countries devastated, with casualties still mounting from the long-term effects of drenching South Vietnam with some of the most lethal carcinogens known, undertaken to destroy ground cover and food crops. The prime target was South Vietnam. The aggression later spread to North Vietnam, then to the remote peasant society of northern Laos, and finally to rural Cambodia, which was bombed at a stunning level, equivalent to all Allied air operations in the Pacific region during World War II, including the 2 atom bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In this case, National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger's orders were being carried out: anything that flies on anything that moves, an open call for genocide that is rare in the historical record. Little of this is remembered. Most was scarcely known beyond narrow circles of activists. When the invasion was launched 50 years ago, concern was so slight that there were few efforts at justification, hardly more than the president's impassioned plea that, "We are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means, for expanding its sphere of influence, and if that conspiracy achieved its ends in Laos and Vietnam, the gates will be opened wide." Elsewhere, he warned further that the complacent, the self-indulgent, the soft societies are about to be swept away with the debris of history, and only the strong can possibly survive, in this case reflecting on the failure of U.S. aggression and terror to crush Cuban independence. By the time protest began to mount half a dozen years later, the respected Vietnam specialist and military historian Bernard Fall, no dove, forecast that Vietnam as a cultural and historic entity is threatened with extinction, as the countryside literally dies under the blows of the largest military machine ever unleashed on an area of this size. He was again referring to South Vietnam. When the war ended, 8 horrendous years later, mainstream opinion was divided between those who described the war as a noble cause that could have been won with more dedication and, at the opposite extreme, the critics, for whom it was a mistake that proved too costly. By 1977, President Carter aroused little notice when he explained that we owe Vietnam no debt because the destruction was mutual. There are important lessons in all this for today, even apart from another reminder that only the weak and defeated are called to account for their crimes. One lesson is that to understand what is happening we should attend not only to critical events of the real world, often dismissed from history, but also to what leaders and elite opinion believe, however tinged with fantasy. Another lesson is that alongside the flights of fancy concocted to terrify and mobilize the public, and perhaps believed by some who are trapped in their own rhetoric, there is also geostrategic planning based on principles that are rational and stable over long periods, because they are rooted in stable institutions and their concerns. I will return to that point, only stressing here that the persistent factors in state action are generally well concealed. The Iraq War is an instructive case. It was marketed to a terrified public on the usual grounds of self-defense against an awesome threat to survival. The single question, George W. Bush and Tony Blair declared, was whether Saddam Hussein would end his programs of developing weapons of mass destruction. When the single question received the wrong answer, government rhetoric shifted effortlessly to our yearning for democracy, and educated opinion duly followed course. Later, as the scale of the U.S. defeat in Iraq was becoming difficult to suppress, the government quietly conceded what had been clear all along. In 2007, the administration officially announced that a final settlement must grant the U.S. military bases and the right of combat operations, and must privilege U.S. investors in the country's rich energy system, demands only reluctantly abandoned in the face of Iraqi resistance, and all kept well hidden from the general population. Gauging American decline. With such lessons in mind, it is useful to look at what is highlighted in the major journals of policy and opinion. Let us keep to the most prestigious of the establishment journals, Foreign Affairs. The headline on the cover of the November/December 2011 issue reads in boldface, "Is America over?" The essay motivating this headline calls for a retrenchment in the humanitarian missions abroad that are consuming the country's wealth, so as to arrest the American decline that is a major theme of international affairs discourse, usually accompanied by the corollary that power is shifting to the east, to China and, maybe, India. The two opening commentaries are on Israel-Palestine. The first, by two high Israeli officials, is entitled, "The Problem is Palestinian Rejectionism." It asserts that the conflict cannot be resolved because Palestinians refuse to recognize Israel as a Jewish state, thereby conforming to standard diplomatic practice. States are recognized, but not privileged sectors within them. The demand for Palestinian recognition is hardly more than a new device to deter the threat of a political settlement that would undermine Israel's expansionist goals. The opposing position, defended by an American professor, is encapsulated by its heading, "The Problem is the Occupation." The subtitle of the article is, "How the Occupation is Destroying the Nation." Which nation? Israel, of course. The paired articles appear on the cover under the heading, "Israel Under Siege." The January/February 2012 issue features yet another call to bomb Iran before it is too late. Warning of the dangers of deterrence, the author suggests that skeptics of military action fail to appreciate the true danger that a nuclear-armed Iran would pose to U.S. interests in the Middle East and beyond. And their grim forecasts assume that the cure would be worse than the disease, that is, that the consequences of a U.S. assault on Iran would be as bad as or worse than those of Iran achieving its nuclear ambitions. But that is a faulty assumption. The truth is that a military strike intended to destroy Iran's nuclear program, if managed carefully, could spare the region and the world a very real threat and dramatically improve the long-term national security of the United States. Others argue that the costs would be too high, and at the extreme some even point out that such an attack would violate international law, as does the stand of the moderates, who regularly deliver threats of violence, in violation of the UN Charter. Let us review these dominant concerns in turn. American decline is real, though the apocalyptic version of it reflects the familiar ruling class perception that anything short of total control amounts to total disaster. Despite the piteous laments, the United States remains the world's dominant power by a large margin, with no competitor in sight, and not only in the military dimension, in which, of course, the United States reigns supreme. China and India have recorded rapid, though highly inegalitarian, growth, but remain very poor countries, with enormous internal problems not faced by the West. China is the world's major manufacturing center, but largely as an assembly plant for the advanced industrial powers on its periphery and for Western multinationals. That is likely to change over time. Manufacturing regularly provides the basis for innovation, often even breakthroughs, as is now sometimes happening in China. One example that has impressed Western specialists is China's takeover of the growing global solar panel market, not on the basis of cheap labor but by coordinated planning and, increasingly, innovation. But the problems China faces are serious. Some are demographic, as reviewed in Science, the leading U.S. science weekly. Its study shows that mortality sharply decreased in China during the Maoist years, mainly a result of economic development and improvements in education and health services, especially the public hygiene movement that resulted in a sharp drop in mortality from infectious diseases. But this progress ended with the initiation of capitalist reforms 30 years ago, and the death rate has since increased. Furthermore, China's recent economic growth has relied substantially on a demographic bonus, a very large working-age population. But the window for harvesting this bonus may close soon, with a profound impact on development. Excess cheap labor supply, which is one of the major factors driving China's economic miracle, will no longer be available. Demography is only one of many serious problems ahead. And for India, the problems are even more severe. Not all prominent voices foresee American decline. Among international media, there is none more serious and responsible than the Financial Times. It recently devoted a full page to the optimistic expectation that new technology for extracting North American fossil fuels might allow the United States to become energy independent, hence retaining its global hegemony for a century. There is no mention of the kind of world the United States would rule over in this happy event, but not for lack of evidence. At about the same time, the International Energy Agency, IEA, reported that, with rapidly increasing carbon emissions from fossil fuel use, the limit of safety with regard to climate change will be reached by 2017 if the world continues on its present course. The door is closing, the IEA's chief economist said, and very soon it will be closed forever. Shortly before that, the U.S. Department of Energy reported its annual carbon dioxide emissions figures, which jumped by the biggest amount on record, to a level higher than the worst-case scenario anticipated by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC. That came as no surprise to many scientists, including the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT's program on climate change, which for years has warned that the IPCC's predictions are too conservative. Such critics of the IPCC predictions receive virtually no public attention. Unlike the fringe climate change denialists who are supported by the corporate sector, along with huge propaganda campaigns that have driven many Americans off the international spectrum, in their dismissal of the threats of climate change. Business support also translates directly into political power. Denialism is part of the catechism that must be intoned by Republican candidates in the farcical election campaigns, now endlessly underway, and in Congress denialists are powerful enough to abort even efforts to inquire into the effects of global warming, let alone do anything serious about it. In brief, American decline can perhaps be stemmed if we abandon hope for decent survival, a prospect that is all too real given the balance of forces in the world. Losing China and Vietnam. Putting such unpleasant thoughts aside, a close look at American decline shows that China indeed plays a large role in it, as has been true for the last 60 years. The decline that now elicits such concern is not a recent phenomenon. It traces back to the end of World War II, when the United States had half the world's wealth and incomparable security and global reach. Planners were naturally well aware of the enormous disparity of power, and intended to keep it that way. The basic viewpoint was outlined with admirable frankness in a major state paper of 1948. The author was one of the architects of the New World Order of the day, the chair of the State Department's policy planning staff, respected statesman and scholar George Kennan, a moderate dove within the planning spectrum. He observed that the central policy goal of the United States should be to maintain the position of disparity that separated our enormous wealth from the poverty of others. To achieve that goal, he advised, we should cease to talk about vague and unreal objectives such as human rights, the raising of the living standards, and democratization, and must deal in straight power concepts, and not be hampered by idealistic slogans about altruism and world benefaction. Kennan was referring specifically to the situation in Asia, but his observations can be generalized, with exceptions, to participants in the U.S.-run global system. It was well understood, however, that the idealistic slogans were to be displayed prominently when addressing others, including the intellectual classes, who were expected to promulgate them. The plans that Kennan helped formulate and implement took for granted that the United States would control the Western Hemisphere, the Far East, the former British Empire, including the incomparable energy resources of the Middle East, and as much of Eurasia as possible, crucially its commercial and industrial centers. These were not unrealistic objectives, given the distribution of power at that moment. But decline set in at once. In 1949, China declared independence, resulting, in the United States, in bitter recriminations and conflict over who was responsible for that loss. The tacit assumption was that the United States owned China by right, along with most of the rest of the world, much as post-war planners assumed. The loss of China was the first significant step in America's decline. It had major policy consequences. One was the immediate decision to support France's effort to reconquer its former colony of Indochina, so that it, too, would not be lost. Indochina itself was not a major concern, despite claims made by President Eisenhower and others about its rich resources. Rather, the concern was the domino theory. Often ridiculed when dominoes don't fall, it remains a leading principle of policy because it is quite rational. To adopt Henry Kissinger's version, a region that falls out of U.S. control can become a virus that will spread contagion, inducing others to follow the same path. In the case of Vietnam, the concern was that the virus of independent development might infect Indonesia, which really does have rich resources. And that might lead Japan, the superdomino, as it was called by the prominent Asia historian John Dower, to accommodate to an independent Asia, becoming its technological and industrial center in a system that would escape the reach of U.S. power. That would have meant, in effect, that the United States had lost the Pacific phase of World War II, fought to prevent Japan's attempt to establish such a new order in Asia. The way to deal with such a problem is clear: destroy the virus and inoculate those who might be infected. In the case of Vietnam, the rational choice was to destroy any hope of successful independent development and impose brutal dictatorships in the surrounding regions. Those tasks were successfully carried out, though history has its own cunning, and something similar to what was feared has nonetheless since been developing in East Asia, much to Washington's dismay. The most important victory of the Indochina Wars was in 1965, when a U.S. backed military coup in Indonesia led by General Suharto carried out massive crimes that were compared by the CIA to those of Hitler, Stalin, and Mao. The staggering mass slaughter, as the New York Times described it, was reported accurately across the mainstream, and with unrestrained euphoria. It was a gleam of light in Asia, as the noted liberal commentator James Reston wrote in the Times. The coup ended the threat of democracy by demolishing the mass-based political party of the poor, established a dictatorship that went on to compile one of the worst human rights records in the world, and threw the riches of the country open to Western investors. Small wonder that, after many other horrors, including the near-genocidal invasion of East Timor, Suharto was welcomed by the Clinton administration in 1995 as "our kind of guy." Years after the great events of 1965, Kennedy Johnson National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy reflected that it would have been wise to end the Vietnam War at that time, with the virus virtually destroyed and the primary domino solidly in place, buttressed by other U.S.-backed dictatorships throughout the region. Similar procedures have been routinely followed elsewhere. Kissinger was referring specifically to the threat of socialist democracy in Chile, a threat ended on the first 9/11, with the vicious dictatorship of General Pinochet subsequently imposed on the country. Viruses have aroused deep concern elsewhere as well, including the Middle East, where the threat of secular nationalism has often concerned British and U.S. planners, inducing them to support radical Islamic fundamentalism to counter it. The concentration of wealth and American decline. Despite such victories, American decline continued. Around the 1970s, it entered a new phase, conscious self-inflicted decline, as planners both private and state shifted the U.S. economy toward financialization and the offshoring of production, driven in part by the declining rate of profit in domestic manufacturing. These decisions initiated a vicious cycle in which wealth became highly concentrated, dramatically so in the top 0.1% of the population, yielding a concentration of political power, and hence legislation to carry the cycle further, revised taxation and other fiscal policies, deregulation, changes in the rules of corporate governance allowing huge gains for executives, and so on. Meanwhile, for the majority, real wages largely stagnated, and people were able to get by only by sharply increased workloads, far beyond those of Europe, unsustainable debt, and, since the Reagan years, repeated bubbles, creating paper wealth that inevitably disappeared when they burst, after which their perpetrators were often bailed out by the taxpayer. In parallel, the political system has been increasingly shredded as both parties are driven deeper into corporate pockets, with the escalating cost of elections, the Republicans to the level of farce, the Democrats not far behind. A recent book-length study by the Economic Policy Institute, which has been the major source of reputable data on these developments for years, is entitled Failure by Design. The phrase "by design" is accurate, other choices were certainly possible. And as the study points out, the failure is class-based. There is no failure for the designers, far from it. The policies are only a failure for the large majority, the 99%, in the imagery of the Occupy movements, and for the country, which has declined and will continue to do so under these policies. One factor is the offshoring of manufacturing. As the Chinese solar panel example mentioned earlier illustrates, manufacturing capacity provides the basis and stimulus for innovation, leading to higher stages of sophistication in production, design, and invention. Those benefits too are being outsourced, not a problem for the money mandarins who increasingly design policy, but a serious problem for working people and the middle classes, and a real disaster for the most oppressed, African Americans, who have never escaped the legacy of slavery and its ugly aftermath, and whose meager wealth virtually disappeared after the collapse of the housing bubble in 2008, setting off the most recent financial crisis, the worst so far. Stirrings abroad. While conscious, self-inflicted decline went on at home, losses continued to mount elsewhere. In the past decade, for the first time in 500 years, South America has taken successful steps to free itself from Western domination. The region has moved toward integration, and has begun to address some of the terrible internal problems of societies ruled by mostly Europeanized elites, tiny islands of extreme wealth in a sea of misery. These nations have also rid themselves of all U.S. military bases and of International Monetary Fund controls. A newly formed organization, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, CELAC, includes all countries of the hemisphere apart from the US and Canada. If it actually functions, that will be another step in American decline, in this case in what has always been regarded as the backyard. Even more serious would be the loss of the MENA countries, Middle East/North Africa, which have been regarded by planners since the 1940s as a stupendous source of strategic power, and one of the greatest material prizes in world history. To be sure, if the projections of a century of U.S. energy independence based on North American energy resources turn out to be realistic, the significance of controlling MENA would decline somewhat, though probably not by much. The main concern has always been control more so than access. However, the likely consequences to the planet's equilibrium are so ominous that discussion may be largely an academic exercise. The Arab Spring, another development of historic importance, might portend at least a partial loss of MENA. The United States and its allies have tried hard to prevent that outcome, so far, with considerable success. Their policy toward the popular uprisings has kept closely to the standard guidelines, support the forces most amenable to U.S. influence and control. Favored dictators must be supported as long as they can maintain control, as in the major oil states. When that is no longer possible, discard them and try to restore the old regime as fully as possible, as in Tunisia and Egypt. The general pattern is familiar from elsewhere in the world: Somoza, Marcos, Duvalier, Mobutu, Suharto, and many others. In the case of Libya, the three traditional imperial powers, violating the UN Security Council resolution they had just sponsored, became the air force of the rebels, sharply increasing civilian casualties and creating a humanitarian disaster and political chaos as the country descended into civil war and weapons poured out to jihadis in Western Africa and elsewhere. Israel and the Republican Party. Similar considerations carry over directly to the second major concern addressed in the November/December 2011 issue of Foreign Affairs cited above, the Israel-Palestine conflict. In this arena, the United States' fear of democracy could hardly be more clearly exhibited. In January 2006, an election took place in Palestine, pronounced free and fair by international monitors. The instant reaction of the United States, and, of course, Israel, with Europe following along politely, was to impose harsh penalties on Palestinians for voting the wrong way. That is no innovation. It is quite in keeping with the general principle recognized by mainstream scholarship. The United States supports democracy if, and only if, the outcomes accord with its strategic and economic objectives. The rueful conclusion of neo-Reaganite Thomas Carruthers, the most careful and respected scholarly analyst of democracy promotion initiatives. More broadly, for 40 years the United States has led the rejectionist camp on Israel-Palestine, blocking an international consensus calling for a political settlement on terms too well known to require repetition. The Western mantra is that Israel seeks negotiations without preconditions, while the Palestinians refuse such terms. The opposite is more accurate. The United States and Israel demand strict preconditions, which are, furthermore, designed to ensure that negotiations will lead either to Palestinian capitulation on crucial issues or nowhere. The first precondition is that the negotiations must be supervised by Washington, which makes about as much sense as demanding that Iran supervise the negotiation of Sunni-Shiite conflicts in Iraq. Serious negotiations would have to take place under the auspices of some neutral party, preferably one that commands some international respect, perhaps Brazil. These negotiations would seek to resolve the conflicts between the two antagonists, the United States and Israel on one side, most of the world on the other. The second precondition is that Israel must be free to expand its illegal settlements in the West Bank. Theoretically, the United States opposes these actions, but with a very light tap on the wrist, while continuing to provide economic, diplomatic, and military support. When the United States does have some limited objections, it very easily bars Israel's actions, as in the case of the E1 project linking Greater Jerusalem to the town of Ma'ale Adumim, virtually bisecting the West Bank, a very high priority for Israeli planners across the political spectrum, but one that raised some objections in Washington, so that Israel has had to resort to devious measures to chip away at the project. The pretense of opposition reached the level of farce in February 2011. When Obama vetoed a UN Security Council resolution calling for implementation of official U.S. policy, and also adding the uncontroversial observation that the settlements themselves are illegal, quite apart from their expansion. Since that time there has been little talk about ending settlement expansion, which continues with studied provocation. Thus, as Israeli and Palestinian representatives prepared to meet in Jordan in January 2011, Israel announced new construction in Pisgat Ze'ev and Har Homa, West Bank areas that it has declared to be within the greatly expanded area of Jerusalem, already annexed, settled, and constructed as Israel's capital, all in violation of direct Security Council orders. Other moves carry forward the grander design of separating whatever West Bank enclaves will be left to Palestinian administration, from the cultural, commercial, and political center of Palestinian life in the former Jerusalem. It is understandable that Palestinian rights should be marginalized in U.S. policy and discourse. Palestinians have no wealth or power. They offer virtually nothing to benefit U.S. policy concerns. In fact, they have negative value, as a nuisance that stirs up the Arab street. Israel, in contrast, is a rich society with a sophisticated, largely militarized high-tech industry. For decades, it has been a highly valued military and strategic ally, particularly since 1967. When it performed a great service to the United States and its ally Saudi Arabia by destroying the Nasserite virus, establishing its special relationship with Washington in the form that has persisted since. It is also a growing center for U.S. high-tech investment. In fact, high-tech, and particularly military, Industries in the two countries are closely linked. Apart from such elementary considerations of great power politics, there are cultural factors that should not be ignored. Christian Zionism in Britain and the United States long preceded Jewish Zionism, and has been a significant elite phenomenon with clear policy implications, including the Balfour Declaration, which drew from it. When General Edmund Allenby conquered Jerusalem during World War I, he was hailed in the American press as Richard the Lion-Hearted, who had at last won the Crusades and driven the pagans out of the Holy Land. The next step was for the chosen people to return to the land promised to them by the Lord. Articulating a common elite view, President Franklin Roosevelt's Secretary of the Interior, Harold Ickes, described Jewish colonization of Palestine as an achievement without comparison in the history of the human race. Such attitudes find their place easily within the providentialist doctrines that have been a strong element in popular and elite culture since the country's origins. The belief that God has a plan for the world and the United States is carrying it forward under divine guidance, as articulated by a long list of leading figures. Moreover, evangelical Christianity is a major popular force in the United States. Further toward the extreme, end-times evangelical Christianity also has enormous popular outreach, invigorated by the establishment of Israel in 1948 and revitalized even more by the conquest of the rest of Palestine in 1967, all signs, in this view, that end times and the Second Coming are approaching. These forces have become particularly significant since the Reagan years, as the Republicans have abandoned the pretense of being a political party in the traditional sense, while devoting themselves in virtual lockstep uniformity to servicing a tiny percentage of the super-rich and the corporate sector. However, the small constituency that is primarily served by the reconstructed party cannot provide votes, so they have to turn elsewhere. The only choice is to mobilize social tendencies that have always been present, though rarely as an organized political force, primarily nativists trembling in fear and hatred and religious elements that are extremist by international standards, but not in the United States. One outcome is reverence for alleged biblical prophecies, hence not only support for Israel and its conquests and expansion but a passionate love for Israel. Another core part of the catechism that must be intoned by Republican candidates, with Democrats, again, not too far behind. These factors aside, it should not be forgotten that the Anglosphere, Britain and its offshoots, consists of settler colonial societies, which rose on the ashes of indigenous populations suppressed or virtually exterminated. Past practices must have been basically correct, in the case of the United States, even ordained by divine providence. Accordingly, there is often an intuitive sympathy for the children of Israel when they follow a similar course. But primarily, geostrategic and economic interests prevail, and policy is not graven in stone. The Iranian threat and the nuclear issue. Let us turn finally to the third of the leading issues addressed in the establishment journals cited earlier, the threat of Iran. Among elites and the political class, this is generally taken to be the primary threat to world order, though not among populations. In Europe, polls show that Israel is regarded as the leading threat to peace. In the MENA countries, that status is shared with the United States, to the extent that in Egypt, on the eve of the Tahrir Square uprising, 80% of the population felt that the region would be more secure if Iran had nuclear weapons. The same polls found that only 10% of Egyptians regard Iran as a threat, unlike the ruling dictators, who have their own concerns. In the United States, before the massive propaganda campaigns of the past few years, a majority of the population agreed with most of the world that, as a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, Iran has a right to carry out uranium enrichment. Even today, a significant majority favors peaceful means for dealing with Iran. There is even strong opposition to military engagement if Iran and Israel are at war. Only a quarter of Americans regard Iran as an important concern for the United States. But it is not unusual for there to be a gap, often a chasm, dividing public opinion and policy. Why exactly is Iran regarded as such a colossal threat? The question is rarely discussed, but it is not hard to find a serious answer, though not, as usual, in the fevered pronouncements of the political elite. The most authoritative answer is provided by the Pentagon and the intelligence services in their regular reports to Congress on global security, which note that Iran's nuclear program and its willingness to keep open the possibility of developing nuclear weapons is a central part of its deterrent strategy. This survey comes nowhere near being exhaustive, needless to say. Among major topics not addressed is the shift of U.S. military policy toward the Asia-Pacific region, with new additions to the huge military base system underway on Jeju Island off South Korea and in northwest Australia, all elements of the policy of containment of China. Closely related is the issue of U.S. bases in Okinawa, bitterly opposed by the population for many years and a continual crisis in U.S. Tokyo-Okinawa relations. Revealing how little fundamental assumptions have changed, U.S. strategic analysts describe the result of China's military programs as a classic security dilemma, whereby military programs and national strategies deemed defensive by their planners are viewed as threatening by the other side, writes Paul Godwin of the Foreign Policy Research Institute. The security dilemma arises over control of the seas off China's coasts. The United States regards its policy of controlling these waters as defensive, while China regards it as threatening. Correspondingly, China regards its actions in nearby areas as defensive, while the United States regards them as threatening. No such debate is even imaginable concerning U.S. coastal waters. This classic security dilemma makes sense, again, on the assumption that the United States has a right to control most of the world, and that U.S. security requires something approaching absolute global control. While the principles of imperial domination have undergone little change, our capacity to implement them has markedly declined as power has become more broadly distributed in a diversifying world. The consequences are many. It is, however, important to bear in mind that, unfortunately, none of them lift the two dark clouds that hover over all consideration of global order, nuclear war and environmental catastrophe, both literally threatening the decent survival of the species. Quite the contrary, both threats are ominous and increasing. 7. Magna Carta, its fate, and ours. Down the road only a few generations, the millennium of Magna Carta, one of the great events in the establishment of civil and human rights, will arrive. Whether it will be celebrated, mourned, or ignored is not at all clear. That should be a matter of serious, immediate concern. What we do right now, or fail to do, will determine what kind of world will greet that event. It is not an attractive prospect if present tendencies persist, not least because the Great Charter is being shredded before our eyes. The first scholarly edition of Magna Carta was published by the eminent jurist William Blackstone. It was not an easy task, there was no good text available. As he wrote, the body of the charter has been unfortunately gnawn by rats, a comment that carries grim symbolism today as we take up the task the rats left unfinished. Blackstone's edition, entitled The Great Charter and the Charter of the Forest, actually includes two charters. The first, the Charter of Liberties, is widely recognized to be the foundation of the fundamental rights of the English-speaking peoples, or as Winston Churchill put it, more expansively, the charter of every self-respecting man at any time in any land. Churchill was referring specifically to the reaffirmation of the charter by Parliament in the Petition of Right, imploring King Charles I to recognize that the law is sovereign, not the king. Charles agreed briefly, but soon violated his pledge, setting the stage for the murderous English Civil War. After a bitter conflict between king and parliament, the power of royalty in the person of Charles II was restored. In defeat, Magna Carta was not forgotten. One of the leaders of Parliament, Henry Vane the Younger, was beheaded, on the scaffold. He tried to read a speech denouncing the sentence as a violation of Magna Carta but was drowned out by trumpets to ensure that such scandalous words would not be heard by the cheering crowds. His major crime had been to draft a petition calling the people the original of all just power in civil society. Not the king, not even God. That was the position that had been strongly advocated by Roger Williams, the founder of the first free society in what is now the state of Rhode Island. His heretical views influenced Milton and Locke, though Williams went much farther, founding the modern doctrine of separation of church and state, still much contested even in the liberal democracies. As often is the case, apparent defeat nevertheless carried the struggle for freedom and rights forward. Shortly after Vane's execution, King Charles II granted a royal charter to the Rhode Island plantations, declaring that the form of government is democratical, and furthermore that the government could affirm freedom of conscience for papists, atheists, Jews, Turks, even Quakers, one of the most feared and brutalized of the many sects that were appearing in those turbulent days. All of this was astonishing in the climate of the times. A few years later, the Charter of Liberties was enriched by the Habeas Corpus Act of 1679, formally entitled An Act for the Better Securing the Liberty of the Subject, and for Prevention of Imprisonment Beyond the Seas. The U.S. Constitution, borrowing from English common law, affirms that the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended, except in case of rebellion or invasion. In a unanimous decision, the U.S. Supreme Court held that the rights guaranteed by this act were considered by the founders of the American Republic as the highest safeguard of liberty. All of these words should resonate today. The Second Charter and the Commons. The significance of the companion charter, the Charter of the Forest, is no less profound and perhaps even more pertinent today, as explored in depth by Peter Linnebaugh in his richly documented and stimulating history of Magna Carta and its later trajectory. The Charter of the Forest demanded protection of the commons from external power. The commons were the source of sustenance for the general population, their fuel, their food, their construction materials, whatever was essential for life. The forest was no primitive wilderness. It had been carefully developed over generations, maintained in common, its riches available to all, and preserved for future generations, practices found today primarily in traditional societies that are under threat throughout the world. The Charter of the Forest imposed limits on privatization. The Robin Hood myths capture the essence of its concerns. It is not too surprising that the popular TV series of the 1950s, The Adventures of Robin Hood, was written anonymously by Hollywood screenwriters blacklisted for leftist convictions. By the 17th century, however, this charter had fallen victim to the rise of the commodity economy and capitalist practice and morality. With the commons no longer protected for cooperative nurturing and use, the rights of the common people were restricted to what could not be privatized, a category that continues to shrink to virtual invisibility. In Bolivia, The attempt to privatize water was, in the end, beaten back by an uprising that brought the indigenous majority to power for the first time in history. The World Bank has ruled that the mining multinational Pacific Rim can proceed with a case against El Salvador for trying to preserve lands and communities from highly destructive gold mining. Environmental constraints threaten to deprive the company of future profits, a crime that can be punished under the rules of the investor rights regime mislabeled as a free trade. And this is only a tiny sample of struggles underway over much of the world, some involving extreme violence, as in the eastern Congo, where millions have been killed in recent years to ensure an ample supply of minerals for cell phones and other uses, and, of course, ample profits. The rise of capitalist practice and morality brought with it a radical revision of how the commons are treated, and also how they are conceived of. The prevailing view today is captured by Garrett Hardin's influential argument that freedom in a commons brings ruin to us all. The famous tragedy of the commons: what is not owned will be destroyed by individual avarice. An international counterpart was the concept of terra nullius, employed to justify the expulsion of indigenous populations in the settler colonial societies of the Anglosphere, or their extermination, as the founding fathers of the American Republic described what they were doing, sometimes with remorse, after the fact. According to this useful doctrine, the Indians had no property rights since they were just wanderers in an untamed wilderness. The hard-working colonists could therefore create value where there was none by turning that same wilderness to commercial use. In reality, the colonists knew better, and there were elaborate procedures of purchase and ratification undertaken by Crown and Parliament, later annulled by force when the evil creatures resisted extermination. The doctrine of terra nullius is often attributed to John Locke, but that is dubious. As a colonial administrator, he understood what was happening, and there is no basis for the attribution in his writings, as contemporary scholarship has shown convincingly, notably the work of the Australian scholar Paul Corcoran. It was in Australia, in fact, that the doctrine has been most brutally employed. The grim forecasts of the tragedy of the commons are not without challenge. The late Elinor Ostrom won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2009, for her work showing the superiority of user-managed fish stocks, pastures, woods, lakes, and groundwater basins. But the conventional doctrine has force if we accept its unstated premise, that humans are blindly driven by what American workers, at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, bitterly called the new spirit of the age, gain wealth forgetting all but self. Like peasants and workers in England before them, American workers denounced this new spirit that was being imposed upon them, regarding it as demeaning and destructive, an assault on the very nature of free men and women. And I stress, women, among those most active and vocal in condemning the destruction of the rights and dignity of free people by the capitalist industrial system were the factory girls, young women from the farms. They, too, were driven into the regime of supervised and controlled wage labor, which was regarded at the time as different from chattel slavery only in that it was temporary. That stand was considered so natural that it became a slogan of the Republican Party, and a banner under which Northern workers carried arms during the American Civil War. Controlling the desire for democracy. That was 150 years ago, in England, earlier. Huge efforts have been devoted since to inculcating the new spirit of the age. Major industries are devoted to the task, public relations, advertising, and marketing generally, all of which add up to a very large component of the gross domestic product. They are dedicated to what the great political economist Thorstein Veblen called fabricating wants. In the words of business leaders themselves, The task is to direct people to the superficial things of life, like fashionable consumption. That way people can be atomized, separated from one another, seeking personal gain alone, diverted from dangerous efforts to think for themselves and challenge authority. The process of shaping opinions, attitudes, and perceptions was termed the engineering of consent by one of the founders of the modern public relations industry, Edward Bernays. He was a respected Wilson Roosevelt Kennedy progressive, much like his contemporary, journalist Walter Lippmann, the most prominent public intellectual of 20th century America, who praised the manufacture of consent as a new art in the practice of democracy. Both recognize that the public must be put in its place, marginalized and controlled, for its own interest, of course. People were too stupid and ignorant to be allowed to run their own affairs. That task was to be left to the intelligent minority, who must be protected from the trampling and the roar of the bewildered herd, the ignorant and meddlesome outsiders, the rascal multitude, as they were termed by their 17th-century predecessors. The role of the general population was to be as spectators, not participants in action, in a properly functioning democratic society. And the spectators must not be allowed to see too much. President Obama has set new standards in safeguarding this principle. He has, in fact, punished more whistleblowers than all previous presidents combined, a real achievement for an administration that came to office promising transparency. Among the many topics that are not the business of the bewildered herd is foreign affairs. Anyone who has studied declassified secret documents will have discovered that, to a large extent, their classification was meant to protect public officials from public scrutiny. Domestically, the rabble should not hear the advice given by the courts to major corporations, that they should devote some highly visible efforts to good works, so that an aroused public will not discover the enormous benefits provided to them by the nanny state. More generally, the U.S. public should not learn that state policies are overwhelmingly regressive, thus reinforcing and expanding social inequality, though designed in ways that lead people to think that the government helps only the undeserving poor, allowing politicians to mobilize and exploit anti-government rhetoric and values even as they continue to funnel support to their better-off constituents. I'm quoting here from the main establishment journal, Foreign Affairs, not from some radical rag. Over time, as societies became freer and the resort to state violence more constrained, the urge to devise sophisticated methods of control of attitudes and opinion has only grown. It is natural that the immense PR industry should have been created in the freest of societies, the United States and Great Britain. The first modern propaganda agency was the British Department of Information during World War I. Its U.S. counterpart, the Committee on Public Information, was formed by Woodrow Wilson to drive a pacifist population to violent hatred of all things German, with remarkable success. American commercial advertising deeply impressed others. Joseph Goebbels admired it and adapted it to Nazi propaganda, all too successfully. The Bolshevik leaders tried as well, but their efforts were clumsy and ineffective. A primary domestic task has always been to keep the public from our throats, as essayist Ralph Waldo Emerson described the concerns of political leaders, when the threat of democracy was becoming harder to suppress in the mid-19th century. More recently, the activism of the 1960s elicited elite concerns about excessive democracy, and calls for measures to impose more moderation in democracy. One particular concern was to introduce better controls over the institutions responsible for the indoctrination of the young, the schools, the universities, and the churches, which were seen as failing that essential task. I'm quoting reactions from the left liberal end of the mainstream ideological spectrum, the liberal internationalists who later staffed the Carter administration and their counterparts in other industrial societies. The right wing was much harsher. One of many manifestations of this urge has been the sharp rise in college tuition. Not on economic grounds, as is easily shown. The device does, however, trap and control young people through debt, often for the rest of their lives, thus contributing to more effective indoctrination. The 3/5 people. Pursuing these important topics further, we see that the destruction of the Charter of the Forest, and its obliteration from memory relate rather closely to the continuing efforts to constrain the promise of the Charter of Liberties. The new spirit of the age cannot tolerate the pre-capitalist conception of the forest, as the shared endowment of the community at large, cared for communally for its own use and for future generations, and protected from privatization, from transfer to the hands of private power for service to wealth, not needs. Inculcating the new spirit is an essential prerequisite for achieving this end, and for preventing the Charter of Liberties from being misused to enable free citizens to determine their own fate. Popular struggles to bring about a freer and more just society have been resisted by violence and repression and massive efforts to control opinion and attitudes. Over time, however, they have met with considerable success, even though there is a long way to go and there is often regression. The most famous part of the Charter of Liberties is Article 39, which declares that no free man shall be punished in any way, nor will we proceed against or prosecute him, except by the lawful judgment of his peers and by the law of the land. Through many years of struggle, the principle has come to hold more broadly. The U.S. Constitution provides that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property, without due process of law, and a speedy and public trial by peers. The basic principle is presumption of innocence, what legal historians describe as the seed of contemporary Anglo-American freedom, referring to Article 39 and, with the Nuremberg Tribunal in mind, a particularly American brand of legalism, punishment only for those who could be proved to be guilty through a fair trial with a panoply of procedural protections, even if their guilt for some of the worst crimes in history is not in doubt. The founders, of course, did not intend the term person to apply to all persons. Native Americans were not persons. Their rights were virtually nil. Women were scarcely persons. Wives were understood to be covered under the civil identity of their husbands in much the same way as children were subject to their parents. Blackstone's principles held that the very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage, or at least is incorporated and consolidated into that of the husband, under whose wing, protection, and cover she performs everything. Women are thus the property of their fathers or husbands. This principle remains in force up to very recent years, until a Supreme Court decision of 1975. Women did not even have a legal right to serve on juries. They were not peers. Slaves, of course, were not persons. They were 3/5 human under the Constitution, so as to grant their owners greater voting power. The protection of slavery was no slight concern to the founders. It was one factor that led to the American Revolution. In the 1772 Somerset case, Lord Mansfield determined that slavery is so odious that it could not be tolerated in England, though it continued in British possessions for many years. American slave owners could see the handwriting on the wall if the colonies remained under British rule. And it should be recalled that the slave states, including Virginia, had the greatest power and influence in the colonies. One can easily appreciate Dr. Johnson's famous quip that, We hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes. Post-Civil War amendments extended the concept of personhood to African Americans, ending slavery, in theory, at least. After about a decade of relative freedom, a condition akin to slavery was reintroduced by a North-South compact permitting the effective criminalization of black life. A black male standing on a street corner could be arrested for vagrancy, or for attempted rape if accused of looking at a white woman the wrong way. And once imprisoned, he had few chances of ever escaping the system of slavery by another name, the term used by then Wall Street Journal bureau chief Douglas Blackman in an arresting study. This new version of the peculiar institution provided much of the basis for the American Industrial Revolution, creating a perfect workforce for the steel industry and mining, along with agricultural production in the famous chain gangs, docile, obedient, disinclined to strike, and with no demand for employers even to sustain their workers, an improvement over the slavery system. The new system lasted in large measure until World War II, when free labor was needed for war production. The post-war boom offered employment. A black man could get a job in a unionized auto plant, earn a decent salary, buy a house, and maybe send his children to college. That lasted for about 20 years, until the 1970s, when the economy was radically redesigned on newly dominant neoliberal principles, with the rapid growth of financialization and the offshoring of production. The black population, now largely superfluous, has been recriminalized. Until Ronald Reagan's presidency, incarceration in the United States was within the spectrum of other industrial societies. By now it is far beyond. It targets primarily black males, but increasingly also black women and Latinos, largely guilty of victimless crimes in the fraudulent drug wars. Meanwhile, the wealth of African American families was virtually obliterated by the latest financial crisis, in no small measure thanks to the criminal behavior of financial institutions, enacted with impunity for the perpetrators, now richer than ever. Looking over the history of African Americans from the first arrival of slaves 400 years ago to the present, it is evident they have enjoyed the status of authentic persons for only a few decades. There is a long way to go to realize the promise of Magna Carta. Sacred persons and undone process. The post-Civil War 14th Amendment granted the rights of persons to former slaves, though mostly in theory. At the same time, it created a new category of persons with rights, corporations. In fact, almost all the cases subsequently brought to the courts under the 14th Amendment had to do with corporate rights, and by a century ago, the courts had determined that these collectivist legal fictions, established and sustained by state power, had the full rights of persons of flesh and blood, in fact, far greater rights, thanks to their scale, their immortality, and the protections of limited liability. The rights of corporations by now far transcend those of mere humans. Under the free trade agreements, the mining company Pacific Rim can, for example, sue El Salvador for seeking to protect its environment. Individuals cannot do the same. General Motors can claim national rights in Mexico. There is no need to dwell on what would happen if a Mexican person demanded national rights in the United States. Domestically, recent Supreme Court rulings greatly enhance the already enormous political power of corporations and the super-rich, striking further blows against the tottering relics of functioning political democracy. Meanwhile, Magna Carta is under more direct assault. Recall the Habeas Corpus Act of 1679, which barred imprisonment beyond the seas, and certainly the far more vicious procedure of imprisonment abroad for the purpose of torture, what is now more politely called rendition, as when Tony Blair rendered Libyan dissident Abdul Hakim Belhaj to the mercies of Muammar al-Gaddafi, or when U.S. authorities deported Canadian citizen Mar Arer to his native Syria for imprisonment and torture, only later conceding that there was never any case against him. The same has happened to many others, often transported through Shannon Airport, leading to courageous protests in Ireland. The concept of due process has been extended under the Obama administration's international drone assassination campaign, in a way that makes this core element of the Charter of Liberties, and the Constitution, null and void. The Justice Department explained that the constitutional guarantee of due process, tracing to Magna Carta, is now satisfied by internal deliberations in the executive branch alone. The constitutional lawyer in the White House agreed. King John might have nodded with satisfaction. The issue arose after the presidentially ordered assassination by drone of Anwar al-Awlaki, accused of inciting jihad in speech, writing, and unspecified actions. A headline in the New York Times captured the general elite reaction when he was murdered in a drone attack, along with the usual collateral damage. It read, in part, "The West celebrates a cleric's death." Some eyebrows were lifted, however, because Awlaki was an American citizen, which raised questions about due process, considered irrelevant when non-citizens are murdered at the whim of the chief executive. And now irrelevant for citizens, too, under the Obama administration's due process legal innovations. Presumption of innocence has also been given a new and useful interpretation. As the New York Times later reported, Mr. Obama embraced a disputed method for counting civilian casualties that did little to box him in. It in effect counts all military-age males in a strike zone as combatants, according to several administration officials, unless there is explicit intelligence posthumously proving them innocent. So post-assassination determination of innocence maintains the sacred principle of presumption of innocence. It would be ungracious to recall, as the Times avoids doing in its report, the Geneva Conventions, the foundation of modern humanitarian law. They bar the carrying out of executions without previous judgment pronounced by a regularly constituted court, affording all the judicial guarantees which are recognized as indispensable by civilized peoples. The most famous recent case of executive assassination was that of Osama bin Laden, murdered after he was apprehended by 79 Navy SEALs, defenseless and accompanied only by his wife. Whatever one thinks of him, he was a suspect and nothing more than that. Even the FBI agreed on this point. The celebrations in the United States were overwhelming, but there were a few questions raised about the bland rejection of the principle of presumption of innocence, particularly when trial was hardly impossible. These were met with harsh condemnations. The most interesting was that of a respected left-liberal political commentator, Matthew Iglesias, who explained that one of the main functions of the international institutional order is precisely to legitimate the use of deadly military force by Western powers, so it is amazingly naive to suggest that the United States should obey international law or other conditions that we righteously demand of the weak. Only tactical objections, it seems, can be raised to aggression, assassination, cyberwar, or other actions that the Holy State undertakes in the service of mankind. If the traditional victims see matters somewhat differently, that merely reveals their moral and intellectual backwardness. And the occasional Western critic who fails to comprehend these fundamental truths can be dismissed as silly. Iglesias explains, incidentally, he is referring specifically to me, and I cheerfully confess my guilt. Executive terrorist lists. Perhaps the most striking assault on the foundations of traditional liberties is a little-known case brought to the Supreme Court by the Obama administration, Holder v. Humanitarian Law Project. The project was condemned for providing material assistance to the guerrilla organization Kurdistan Workers' Party, PKK, which has fought for Kurdish rights in Turkey for many years and is listed as a terrorist group by the state executive. The material assistance was legal advice. The wording of the ruling would appear to apply quite broadly, for example, to discussions and research inquiry, even to advice to the PKK to keep to non-violent means. Again, there was a marginal fringe of criticism, but even those critiques generally accepted the legitimacy of the state terrorist list, that is, arbitrary decisions by the executive, with no legal recourse. The record of the terrorist list is of some interest. One of the ugliest examples of the use of the terrorist list has to do with the tortured people of Somalia. Immediately after September 11, the United States closed down the Somali charitable network Al-Barakat on grounds that it was financing terror. This achievement was hailed as one of the great successes of the War on Terror. In contrast, Washington's withdrawal of its charges as without merit a year later aroused little notice. Al-Barakat was responsible for about half the $500 million in remittances sent back to Somalia annually, more than Somalia earns from any other economic sector and 10 times the amount of foreign aid it receives, a UN review determined. The charity also ran major businesses in Somalia, all of which were destroyed. The leading academic scholar of Bush's financial war on terror, Ibrahim Ward, concludes that apart from devastating the economy, this frivolous attack on a very fragile society may have played a role in the rise of Islamic fundamentalists, another familiar consequence of the War on Terror. The very idea that the state should have the authority to make such judgments unchecked is a serious offense against the Charter of Liberties, as is the fact that it is considered uncontentious. If the Charter's fall from grace continues on the path of the past few years, the future of rights and liberties looks dim. Who will have the last laugh? A few final words on the fate of the Charter of the Forest. Its goal was to protect the source of sustenance for the population, the commons, from external power. In the early days, from royalty, over the years, from enclosures and other forms of privatization by predatory corporations and the state authorities who cooperate with them, which have only accelerated and are properly rewarded. The damage is very broad. If we listen to voices from the global south today, we can learn that the conversion of public goods into private property through the privatization of our otherwise commonly held natural environment is one way neoliberal institutions remove the fragile threads that hold African nations together. Politics today has been reduced to a lucrative venture where one looks out mainly for returns on investment, rather than on what one can contribute to rebuild highly degraded environments, communities, and a nation. This is one of the benefits that structural adjustment programs inflicted on the continent, the enthronement of corruption. I'm quoting Nigerian poet and activist Nimo Bassi, chair of Friends of the Earth International, in his searing exposé of the ravaging of Africa's wealth, To Cook a Continent, which examines the latest phase of the Western torture of Africa. A torture that has always been planned at the highest level, and should be recognized as such. At the end of World War II, the United States held a position of unprecedented global power. Not surprisingly, careful and sophisticated plans were developed for organizing the world. Each region was assigned its function by State Department planners, headed by the distinguished diplomat George Kennan. He determined that the United States had no special interest in Africa, so it should be handed over to Europe to exploit, his word, for its reconstruction. In the light of history, one might have imagined a different relationship between Europe and Africa, but there is no indication that that was ever considered. More recently, the United States has recognized that it, too, must join the game of exploiting Africa, alongside new entrants like China, which is busily at work compiling one of the worst records in destruction of the environment and oppression of hapless victims. It should be unnecessary to dwell on the extreme dangers posed by one central element of the predatory obsessions that are producing calamities all over the world, the reliance on fossil fuels, which courts global disaster, perhaps in the not-too-distant future. Details may be debated, but there is little doubt that the problem is serious, if not awesome, and that the longer we delay in addressing it, the more awful will be the legacy left to generations to come. There are some efforts afoot to face reality, but they are far too minimal. Meanwhile, power concentrations are charging in the opposite direction, led by the richest and most powerful country in world history. Congressional Republicans are dismantling the limited environmental protections initiated by Richard Nixon, who would be something of a dangerous radical in today's political scene. The major business lobbies openly announce their propaganda campaigns to convince the public that there is no need for undue concern, with some effect, as polls show. The media cooperate by barely reporting the increasingly dire climate change forecasts of international agencies, and even the U.S. Department of Energy. The standard presentation is a debate between alarmists and skeptics, on one side virtually all qualified scientists, on the other a few holdouts. Not part of the debate are a very large number of experts, including those in the climate change program at MIT, among others, who criticize the scientific consensus because it is too conservative and cautious, arguing that the truth when it comes to climate change is far more dire. Not surprisingly, the public is confused. In his 2012 State of the Union speech, President Obama hailed the bright prospects of a century of energy self-sufficiency, thanks to new technologies that permit extraction of hydrocarbons from Canadian tar sands, shale, and other previously inaccessible sources. Others agree. The Financial Times forecasts a century of energy independence for the U.S. Unasked in these optimistic forecasts is the question of what kind of a world will survive the rapacious onslaught. In the lead in confronting the crisis throughout the world are indigenous communities, those who have always upheld the charter of the forests. The strongest stand has been taken by the one country they govern, Bolivia, the poorest country in South America and for centuries, a victim of Western destruction of the rich resources of one of the most advanced of the developed societies in the hemisphere, pre-Columbus. After the ignominious collapse of the Copenhagen Global Climate Change Summit in 2009, Bolivia organized a World Peoples Conference on climate change with 35,000 participants from 140 countries, not just representatives of governments but also members of civil society and activists. It produced a people's agreement, which called for very sharp reductions in emissions, and a universal declaration on the rights of Mother Earth. Establishing the rights of the planet is a key demand of indigenous communities all over the world. It is ridiculed by sophisticated Westerners, but unless we can acquire some of the indigenous sensibility, they are likely to have the last laugh. A laugh of grim despair.